Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I am your host, Captain Xavier, and strap yourselves in because today we are going to be covering the 3-switch Rapidstrike wiring diagram, which is by far the most complicated of the wiring diagrams I've showed so far. Possibly not the most complicated wiring for any Nerf blaster out there, but definitely the most complicated of the stock ones that I've shown you so far. We will start by going over the major components. We first have the battery housing, which has a negative and a positive. We then have what I'm going to refer to as the flywheel assembly, which will have a negative and a positive. The motors themselves do not have negative and positive. How you wire them up will determine which way the motor spins. But once you have them in the cage with the motors, you then need to wire it up properly so that they spin opposite directions and spin in towards each other and will push the dart out. At that point, there is a negative and a positive, because if you put it the wrong way, they will spin the other direction and they will shoot the darts into the blaster. So this assembly has a negative and a positive, though the motors do not technically. I have a video on how to wire your flywheel motor. I will have it in the description, or you can watch the playlist, and that'll explain how you actually create this assembly. Next, we have our pusher motor. We then have 3 switches. We have what I will refer to as the return switch, the trigger switch, and the rev switch. And the reason this has 3 switches and the reason it is more complicated is because they wanted to ensure that no matter how briefly you pull the trigger, it always completes one full cycle, which means you could just barely tap it and let go and it will do one full cycle of the pusher and it will make sure that you push one dart. It also ensures that the pusher arm always returns all the way back to the resting position after you've let go of the firing trigger. And I feel that that is actually very important. It is possible to wire up a Rapidstrike without this switch, just using a Hyperfire's wiring diagram so that the trigger directly controls the pusher arm. The downside is it won't necessarily complete one cycle. You might pull it, let go, and it won't actually push the dart far enough to ever engage the flywheels. And so you pull the trigger and nothing happens. The other problem is that it doesn't return the arm all the way to the resting position, which means the next time you pull the trigger, you have to wait for the arm to return and then go forward to fire. And while that shouldn't take very long, that's enough of a disadvantage that I say it's much better to just learn how to do the 3rd switch and save yourself the trouble. It's not that much more complicated, and I'm really hoping that this video will help break it down in a way that it's much easier to understand. The Rapidstrike does very much utilize motor braking in order to facilitate this. That's how it ensures that the pusher arm stops when it gets all the way back. The variable circuits will be represented using yellow wire in this video. In my wiring diagrams, they are represented by the purple because I use red and blue to represent positive and negative, and the variable circuits can be either of those depending on the position of the switch that they're coming off of. We are going to start with them. The first one goes from the COM on our return switch and goes to the normally closed on our trigger switch. The other one goes from the COM on our trigger switch to the positive on our pusher motor. And these are the most important ones because if you get this wrong, you run the risk of shorting out your battery, and that is bad. So COM to normally closed, COM to positive. Next, we'll go over the negative circuit, which goes from the negative on the battery housing to the negative on the flywheel assembly. It then goes from the negative on the battery to the normally open on our return switch. And finally, it goes from the normally open on our return switch to the negative on the pusher motor. The positive circuit then goes from the positive on our battery to the normally open on our rev switch. COM on the rev switch then goes to the positive on our flywheel motors. And at this point, if we pull the rev trigger, the motors will spin. We are also then going to go from the COM on our rev switch to the normally open on our trigger switch. And from the normally open on our trigger switch, we finally go to the normally closed on our return switch. And that is the full circuit. When we turn on the rev switch, all of the motors are going to start spinning. And the reason that is the case is because the return switch, when the blaster is not being fired, is normally pressed. The pusher arm, when it comes back, pushes down on our return trigger, and it stops this motor from spinning. When we pull the trigger switch, it will turn. And that is the wiring diagram. This is what you need to know to make it work. For those of you who don't have any interest in knowing why it works, now would be a good time to stop watching because it's about to get confusing. For those of you who are curious how this switch works and why, I'm now going to go into the nitty-gritty details, which I find fascinating and you might find interesting also. Okay, I have removed the flywheel circuit entirely just for simplification. Let's take a look at the path of current through the pusher mechanism. So it starts with the battery, of course, goes into the normally open of our rev switch, and then comes out the COM of our rev switch. So the rev switch has to be on for this system to have power at all, obviously. The system is at rest, normally, with this switch being pressed. When the pusher arm is in its resting position, the return switch is, in fact, pressed. So power is coming from COM going to normally open. So when you pull the trigger, it completes the circuit on the normally open to the COM. So we have the positive going through to the COM, going to the motor, and the motor spins whenever you pull the trigger. And it will do that regardless of the position of this trigger, but this one also has to be pressed. And this is how it works in the Hyperfire and the Chaos and the Nemesis. That's where it is. When you pull it, it fires. If you're not pulling it, it's not firing. And that's fairly simple. But the Rapidstrike needs to have that arm always complete one rotation, and it needs the arm to return back when it's done. And that is what this switch does. So when you let go of the trigger switch, you're now connecting up, you're completing the circuit on the normally closed is now going to COM. But the normally closed is variable. So it can be either negative or positive, depending on this switch. So when this switch is pressed, which means the pusher arm is all the way back, then you have the negative connecting up, because when it's pressed, it's connected to the normally open circuit. So we have negative coming through to our COM, going to our normally closed, and since this is a normally closed, that goes through to COM, and we therefore have negative going to both sides of the motor. It grounds it out, and it halts it. And it, in fact, initiates a motor brake, so it will stop very quickly when it gets there. When this switch is not pressed, that means that the pusher arm is pushing out. It completes the circuit. And what that does is it means that even though you've let go of the trigger, but the pusher arm has not returned yet, therefore you've got, this is not pushed, which means we're in the normally closed circuit is completed. And since this is not pushed, its normally closed circuit is completed, and its normally closed is positive. So we have positive coming out of the COM, going into normally closed, coming out of the COM, positive goes to the other side of the motor, and it will continue to spin until the pusher arm returns all the way back, and this gets pressed. That is how it ensures that the slightest trigger pull will complete one full cycle, and ensures that the pusher arm always returns to a resting position. Hopefully this has made it easier to understand and not more difficult. Like I said, you don't need to know why it works. Just trust me, if you wire it up like this, it will work. So, wiring diagram is available on my Facebook page. I will have the links in the description. I also have the video for the Flywheel Assembly in the description. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or corrections, go ahead and put them in the comment section. And as always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.